The rumble of 40 Harley-Davidson engines vibrated through the dense Oregon pine forest, a mechanical thunder that shook the needles from the lower branches. The Hells Angels Cascade Charter was 70 miles into their annual memorial ride down Highway 12. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long, golden shadows across the cracked asphalt. The air smelled of hot exhaust, melting tar, and the sharp, clean scent of cedar. Dodge Hammer Malone was riding point. At 6'5" and 260 pounds of tattooed muscle, he looked like a man carved out of granite. He rode a custom black road glide, the wind whipping at his heavy leather cut. One moment, the highway stretched empty through the tunnel of trees. The next, a tiny, ragged figure broke from the tree line. Hammer didn't think, he reacted. He slammed his left fist high into the air, the universal signal to stop, and grabbed a handful of front brake, downshifting aggressively. Behind him, 39 riders instantly mirrored his movements. Tires bit into the hot asphalt, engines roaring in protest as 40 heavy cruisers dropped speed in perfect, staggered formation. Hammer skidded to a halt, his heavy combat boots slamming onto the pavement to balance the bike. A little girl stood dead center in his lane. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. She wore a nightgown that might have once been white, but was now stained with mud, pine sap, and rusty streaks of blood. Her bare feet were mutilated, caked in dirt and gravel. She wasn't shrinking away from the deafening, intimidating wall of leather and chrome. She was running directly toward them, arms waving frantically, her mouth open in a soundless scream that was drowned out by the engines. Hammer killed his ignition. Down the line, the other riders did the same. The sudden silence that swallowed the highway was deafening, pierced only by the sharp, ragged shrieks of the child. Hammer kicked his kickstand down and swung his heavy frame off the bike, dropping to one knee on the scorching asphalt as the girl collided with him. She crashed into his chest, her tiny, trembling hands locking into the heavy denim of his vest. She felt like a bird trapped in a snare, fragile, frantic, vibrating with absolute terror. "Mommy," she gasped out, her chest heaving violently. Tears cut clean tracks through the thick layer of grime on her face. The bad men, a rope. They put a rope on her. Hammer's heart slammed against his ribs, but his face remained a mask of calm. Years of working as an ER trauma nurse in a past life snapped his brain directly into triage mode. He ran his massive hands over her shoulders and back, checking for penetrating wounds, broken bones, or active bleeding. Superficial lacerations, severe shock, extreme exhaustion. Hey, look at me," Hammer rumbled, pitching his naturally booming voice into a soft, steady hum. "You're safe. Nobody is going to hurt you here. Where is your mommy, little bird?" She pointed a shaking, bloody finger back the way she had come, toward a barely visible, overgrown logging road jutting off the highway. "The cabin. She told me to hide under the floor in the dirt. They pulled her up to the roof. She stopped moving. She stopped making sounds." Footsteps crunched on the gravel. Tank, the charter's road captain and a former Marine combat medic, materialized beside Hammer. Tank was leaner than Hammer, with cold, calculating eyes that missed nothing. He took one look at the child's feet, the dried blood, and the fading daylight. "She's been running a long time, Hammer," Tank said grimly. "Hours, at least." Razor, the charter president, walked up, adjusting his sunglasses. He didn't hesitate. "Tank, wrench gauge. Take 4 more riders. Go up that logging road. Weapons hot, but keep it quiet. We don't know who is still up there, and we don't need a bloodbath if we can avoid it. Hammer, stay with the kid. Get her warm, get her fluids. Rest of us, set a perimeter." Razor pulled his cell phone from his vest, turning away to dial 911. Hammer scooped the little girl up. She weighed practically nothing. He carried her to the grassy shoulder of the road, sitting down in the shade of an old oak tree and settling her into his lap. He unbuttoned his heavy leather cut and wrapped it around her shivering shoulders. "What's your name, honey?" he asked, pulling a canteen of water from his saddlebag. "Sophie," she stammered, burying her face against his collarbone. "I've got you, Sophie. My brothers are going to find your mom." 3 miles up the deeply rutted dirt road, Tank killed his engine, signaling the 6 riders behind him to do the same. They coasted the last 50 yards in eerie silence, the heavy bikes crunching softly over fallen pine needles. Through the trees, a small, isolated A-frame cabin came into view. Tank dismounted, drawing a heavy 1911 from his shoulder holster. Beside him, Wrench pulled a tactical shotgun from a custom scabbard on his bike. Tank used hand signals to split the men up, sending 3 around to the back while he, Wrench, and Gage approached the front. The front door was splintered completely off its hinges, hanging drunkenly inward. Tank stepped over the threshold, his gun raised. The smell hit him first, the copper tang of blood mixed with the distinct, sour odor of human terror. The cabin's interior was a disaster zone. Heavy wooden chairs were smashed to kindling. Dishes shattered across the kitchen linoleum. A large pool of dark, tacky blood stained the rug near the sofa. And in the center of the living room, hanging from an exposed ceiling rafter, was a woman. Her hands were bound brutally tight behind her back with zip ties. A thick yellow nylon rope was knotted around her neck. An overturned dining chair lay just inches beneath her dangling, purple feet. "Clear!" Gage shouted from the back room. "House is clear. Cut her down." Tank bellowed, holstering his weapon and sprinting forward. Wrench dropped his shotgun and grabbed the woman around the waist, taking her dead weight against his chest. Tank produced a serrated survival knife and slashed upward, sawing through the thick nylon rope in 2 frantic strokes. They lowered her gently to the hardwood floor. It was a horrific sight. Her face was swollen and a terrifying shade of mottled purple. Her lips were blue. The skin around her throat was rubbed raw, bleeding, and deeply indented by the rope. Tank dropped to his knees, pressing 2 fingers hard against her carotid artery. He stared at the ceiling, holding his own breath. Silence. Silence. Then, a faint, erratic, thready flutter against his fingertips. "She's alive. Get the med bag now," Tank shouted. He immediately tilted her head back, wincing at the grinding feeling in her neck, praying he wasn't paralyzing her to open her swollen airway. He pinched her nose, sealed his mouth over hers, and breathed in. 1, 2, 3 for breathe. For 2 agonizing minutes, there was absolutely nothing. Wrench knelt beside him, ready to start chest compressions. Gage stood by the door, gun drawn, watching the tree line. 1, 2, 3 for breathe. Suddenly, the woman's spine arched violently off the floor. She sucked in a wet, horrific, rattling gasp. Her eyes flew open, bloodshot and wild with blind, animalistic panic. She thrashed, her zip-tied hands straining, her legs kicking out as she fought invisible ghosts. "Easy, hold still. You're safe," Tank barked, using his body weight to pin her shoulders down so she wouldn't further damage her crushed windpipe. "Listen to me. Sophie sent us. Your little girl is safe. She's with my brothers." The name acted like a chemical sedative. The woman went rigid, then sagged against the floorboards. Tears spilled from the corners of her swollen eyes, washing tracks through the blood on her cheeks. She tried to speak, but her mouth only formed the shapes. A horrific, wheezing hiss escaped her lips. She rolled her head desperately, locking eyes with Tank. She raised a trembling, bound hand and pointed frantically toward the heavy stone fireplace on the far wall. "Brick," she mouthed, the word soundless. "Left. Bottom." Tank looked at Wrench. "Check the hearth." Wrench immediately dropped to his knees by the fireplace. He ran his fingers along the soot-stained stones, finding one on the bottom left corner that felt slightly loose. He wedged his combat knife behind the mortar and pried. The stone slid out with a grinding scrape. Behind it, in a dark cavity, sat a heavy-duty waterproof bag containing a USB flash drive and a folded piece of hotel stationery. Wrench pulled the paper out and unfolded it. He read it aloud, his jaw tightening so hard the muscles jumped in his cheeks. "If you find this, I am dead. My name is Dr. Gracechin. This drive contains absolute proof of an illegal organ harvesting ring operating out of Cascade Regional Hospital. High-level doctors and administrators are intentionally inducing medical crises in vulnerable patients, homeless, addicts, wards of the state, to harvest and sell their organs to international brokers. Give this to the FBI. Do not trust local authorities. They are on the payroll. Tank looked down at Grace, whose eyes were fluttering shut as she slipped back into the mercy of unconsciousness. "We got it, Doc," Tank whispered fiercely. "We got it. Just stay with us." 30 minutes later, the wail of sirens finally broke the ambient noise of the forest. Down on the highway, an Oregon State Police cruiser came screeching to a halt near the barricade of motorcycles. Sergeant Avery stepped out of the cruiser. She was a 20-year veteran, her hand resting warily on her duty weapon as she took in the sight of 40 Hells Angels blocking the interstate. Then her eyes found Hammer sitting in the dirt, rocking a bandaged, sleeping child. Razor stepped forward slowly, hands empty and visible. "Sergeant, my men found the mother up at the cabin. She was hung, barely holding on. Tank is keeping her breathing." Razor handed Avery Wrench's phone, which displayed high-definition photos of the crime scene they'd taken before cutting Grace down, along with a picture of the handwritten note. Avery's face drained of color as she swiped through the images, reading the note twice. "Cascade Regional," she muttered, looking up at Razor, her suspicion replaced by cold, professional horror. "We had 3 suspicious John Doe deaths there last year. Families swore something was wrong, but the hospital's paperwork was airtight. We couldn't prove a damn thing." She handed the phone back. "I'm bypassing local dispatch. I'm calling the FBI field office in Portland directly. EMS is 2 minutes out." When the rural ambulance finally arrived at the cabin, the paramedics took one look at the severe bruising and swelling around Grace's neck, recognized the imminent threat of a totally collapsed trachea, and immediately called for a life flight helicopter. Hours later, the stark, buzzing fluorescent lights of Portland's legacy Emmanuel Medical Center cast long shadows over the surgical waiting wing. 6 massive bikers in full leather cuts stood guard. Hammer paced the linoleum floor, still holding Sophie. She had woken up crying in the squad car on the way over, and since then, she absolutely refused to let go of him, her tiny fingers permanently twisted into his shirt. Tank sat in a plastic chair in the corner, staring blankly at the wall. His hands and forearms were still stained rust-brown with Grace's dried blood. Finally, the heavy double doors of the surgical ward pushed open. A trauma surgeon in green scrubs stepped out, pulling down her surgical mask. She looked exhausted, her eyes scanning the imposing men cautiously. "Family of Grace Chin?" she asked. "We're it," Hammer growled softly, stopping his pacing. "She's out of surgery," the doctor said, exhaling a long breath. It was incredibly close. Her airway was severely compromised, and there was significant trauma to the cervical spine, but we stabilized her. We put a temporary tracheostomy in to help her breathe while the swelling goes down. She's going to make a full recovery, though she won't be able to speak for several weeks. Tank let out a long, ragged exhale. The invisible tension holding him upright seemed to snap. Without a word to the group, he stood up, walked into the nearby public restroom, and turned on the sink. He pumped a massive glob of cheap pink hospital soap into his palms and scrubbed. He scrubbed until the water running down the stainless steel drain turned pink, then brown, then finally clear. He leaned his heavy weight against the porcelain sink, staring at his bloodshot eyes in the mirror, and allowed himself one shaky, shuddering breath. They hadn't been too late. Back in the hallway, the victory was brutally short-lived. The elevator doors pinged open, and a woman in a sharp blazer holding a clipboard stepped out, accompanied by 2 hospital security guards. She marched directly toward Hammer. "Excuse me, are you Mr. Malone?" she asked briskly. "I'm Patricia Moore with Child Protective Services. The state police notified us of the situation. We need to take the child, Sophie, into emergency foster placement immediately until her mother is conscious, evaluated, and the home environment is deemed safe." Hammer stopped rocking. His arms tightened instinctively around the little girl. He slowly turned his body away from the social worker, shielding Sophie. He planted his heavy boots shoulder-width apart. "No disrespect, ma'am," Hammer said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated in his chest. "But the people who tried to string her mother up are still out there. This little girl is not going to a stranger's house." Patricia sighed, adopting a patronizing tone. "It is state law, sir. You have absolutely no legal relation to this child. You are a bystander. Please hand her over, or I will have security remove her from your custody." Behind Hammer, the other 5 Hell's Angels moved. It wasn't a sudden rush. It was a slow, deliberate shifting of mass. They formed a solid human wall between Hammer and the security guards, crossing their arms over their chests. The security guards suddenly looked very pale, subtly taking a half-step backward. "We're not looking for trouble," Razor said calmly, stepping to the front. "But you're not taking this kid. She watched her mother get tortured. She ran miles on bloody feet. Hammer is the one who caught her. She feels safe with him. You put her in the system tonight. Those traffickers will find her by morning." "I am calling the police," Patricia said, her voice shaking slightly as she reached for her phone. "Call M," Tank said, emerging from the bathroom. "Call Sergeant Avery of the State Police. Ask her where this kid belongs right now." It took a tense, agonizing 12-hour standoff. Hammer sat in the hard plastic chair all night, refusing to surrender the girl, refusing to sleep, daring anyone to try and take her. The hospital administrators were called. Lawyers were consulted over the phone. The impasse only broke the next morning when the surgeon allowed Patricia, Hammer, and an attorney into the ICU. Grace was awake. She looked fragile, lost in a sea of tubes and monitors, a thick plastic tube protruding from the bandages on her neck. Her eyes, however, were sharp and terrified. Hammer stepped forward, holding a sleeping Sophie so Grace could see her. "She's okay, Doc," Hammer whispered. "She's perfectly safe. But this lady from the state wants to put her in foster care until you're out of here." Grace's eyes widened in horror. The heart monitor beside her bed began to beep frantically. She shook her head wildly, reaching out a bruised hand toward Hammer. "I won't let them take her," Hammer promised, stepping closer. "But I need you to do something. They say I need legal permission to watch her." The attorney stepped forward with a clipboard and a pen. "Dr. Chun, if you are of sound mind, you can sign a temporary emergency guardianship proxy. It places Sophie in Mr. Malone's custody for the duration of your hospitalization." Grace didn't hesitate. With a violently shaking hand, she took the pen and scrawled a messy, nearly illegible signature on the bottom line. Patricia Moore sighed, defeated by the paperwork. "Fine. He has temporary custody, but we will be monitoring the situation." Hammer lived on 5 acres of fenced-in property on the outskirts of Portland. His house was a modest, single-story ranch, but it was secure. It had heavy deadbolts, security cameras, and a reinforced steel gate at the driveway. More importantly, it had Brutus and Buster, 2 massive, slobbering Mastiff rescue dogs that Hammer had saved from a fighting ring years ago. When Hammer carried Sophie through the front door on their first night, the dogs approached cautiously, sniffing the tiny girl. Sophie, exhausted and overwhelmed, reached a bandaged hand out. Brutus, a 140-pound behemoth, immediately melted, resting his massive head gently on her lap and letting out a soft whine. "They like you," Hammer said, smiling softly. "They're good boys. They'll keep you safe." But the trauma of the highway couldn't be erased by friendly dogs and locked doors. That first night, at 2 a.m., Hammer was jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream. He threw off his blankets, grabbed the baseball bat he kept by his bed, and sprinted down the hall in his sweatpants. He burst into the spare bedroom. Sophie was sitting bolt upright in the center of the bed, her eyes wide open but completely unseeing. She was screaming, swatting at the air, caught in a vivid night terror. "Sophie! Hey, little bird, you're safe." Hammer dropped the bat and scooped her up. She thrashed against him, crying hysterically, completely lost in the memory of the men in suits tying the rope. Hammer sat in the rocking chair in the corner of the room, holding her tight against his broad chest, rocking her slowly. "I've got you," he kept repeating, his deep voice rumbling against her ear. "I'm right here. The bad men are gone. I'm right here." It took 20 minutes for the terror to break, leaving her sobbing against his t-shirt. Why did they hurt her? Sophie hiccuped, clinging to him. "Mommy helps people." Hammer closed his eyes, resting his chin on the top of her head. "Because there are bad people in the world, Sophie. People who only care about money. But there are good people too. Your mom is one of the best." Sophie sniffled, looking up at him in the dim light. "Are you a good person, Hammer?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He thought about the things he had done in his youth, the anger he had carried, the bar fights, the stint in county lockup. "I try to be, kid. I try." He hesitated, then decided she deserved the truth. "A long time ago I had a little girl, just about your age. Her name was Maya." Sophie's eyes widened. "Where is she?" "She got very sick," Hammer said, his voice thick with a grief he hadn't spoken aloud in a decade. "The doctors couldn't fix her. She went to heaven. After that, I was very angry for a very long time. I didn't think I could ever protect anyone again. But then you ran out onto that highway." He brushed a strand of hair out of her eyes. "You gave me a second chance, little bird, to do things right." Sophie reached up and patted his bearded cheek. "I'm glad you stopped, Hammer." Over the next 3 weeks, Hammer's house transformed into an impenetrable fortress of domesticity. The Cascade Charter organized round-the-clock protection shifts. There were never less than 4 armed bikers on the property at all times. Neighbors walking their dogs would cross the street to avoid the intimidating men in leather cuts pacing the perimeter, oblivious to what was happening inside. Inside, men who had done hard time were sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, letting Sophie put plastic tiaras on their bald heads while they drank imaginary tea. Wrench, a master mechanic, spent 3 days helping Sophie build a highly complex Lego castle. Tank, the grizzled combat veteran, turned out to be an incredible cook, making Mickey Mouse pancakes every morning that made Sophie smile. They visited Grace at the hospital every single afternoon. Because Grace couldn't speak, they communicated via a dry erase board. Hammer would sit by her bed, holding her hand while Sophie told her mother animated stories about the dogs and the bikers. Hammer and Grace would exchange looks over the child's head, looks of profound gratitude, silent understanding, and a growing, unmistakable spark of affection. While Sophie was building Legos, the FBI was building a cage. Special Agent Carmen Vega of the Portland Field Office was a legend in the Bureau for dismantling human trafficking rings. She was relentless, sharp, and entirely devoid of humor. She spent a week practically living in Grace's hospital room. Because of the tracheostomy, Grace couldn't speak, so Vega provided her with a tablet and a keyboard. For days, the keyboard clacked endlessly as Grace typed out the nightmare she had uncovered. "I noticed the discrepancies 3 months ago," Grace typed, the words appearing on the screen for Vega to read. "Patients in the ICU, mostly wards of the state or homeless individuals with no emergency contacts, were crashing during routine procedures. The mortality rate for Dr. Harrison's ward was 400% higher than the national average." "How were they taking the organs?" Vega asked, recording the interview. "Induced cardiac arrest," Grace typed. "They would administer a lethal dose of potassium. It looks like a natural heart attack on the monitors. Then, because the patient was an organ donor, they would harvest the kidneys, liver, and heart immediately." Richard Lawson, the hospital administrator, was falsifying the donor registry and selling the organs on the black market to wealthy overseas buyers. Vega's eyes were cold. "And you downloaded the financial ledgers?" "Yes. The flash drive has the offshore routing numbers. Lawson found out I accessed the server. He sent his men to the cabin." "You gave us the key to the kingdom, Dr. Chun," Vega said softly. "Now let us lock the door." 3 weeks to the day after the highway rescue, the FBI moved in. It wasn't a quiet arrest. It was a coordinated, overwhelming tactical strike. At 6 a.m., 3 armored FBI Bearcats smashed through the security gates of Richard Lawson's sprawling suburban estate. SWAT teams in full tactical gear blew the front doors off the hinges, flooding the house. Lawson was dragged out of his bed in his silk pajamas, screaming about his lawyers as he was thrown onto his own manicured lawn and zip-tied. Simultaneously, 50 federal agents raided Cascade Regional Hospital. They locked down the administrative wing, seizing servers, hard drives, and physical files. Dr. Harrison was arrested in the middle of a shift change, handcuffed in the lobby in front of his staff. In a single morning, 12 hospital employees, including 3 surgeons, the chief administrator, and 2 procurement nurses, were taken into federal custody. The evidence on Grace's flash drive was bulletproof. Confronted with the offshore bank records, 2 of the nurses immediately folded, turning state's evidence and providing the names of the international brokers. The ring was entirely, irrevocably crushed. 6 months later, the air inside the Hells Angels Cascade Charter Clubhouse smelled of stale beer, motor oil, and roasting barbecue. The club was packed to the rafters. It was a celebration of life, of survival, and of family. Grace stood near the massive wooden bar. The heavy bandages were gone, leaving only a thin, pale silver scar across her throat. She had regained her voice entirely, though it now carried a slight, raspy texture. She smiled, a genuine, radiant expression, as she watched Hammer step up onto the small wooden stage at the front of the room. He tapped the microphone. "All right, settle down, you ugly bastards." Hammer boomed over the speakers, drawing a roar of laughter from the crowd. He looked down into the front row. "Sophie, get up here." Sophie, now a vibrant, healthy 6-year-old, bounded up the stairs. The nightmares had faded. The terror had been replaced by the absolute confidence of a child who knows she is fiercely, unconditionally loved by the most dangerous men in the state. Hammer knelt down in front of her. From behind his back, he produced a tiny, custom-tailored leather vest. "Little bird," Hammer said, his voice thick with emotion. "This club exists for a lot of reasons, mostly because we didn't fit in anywhere else. But our absolute highest law is that we protect the innocent. You saved your mother's life. You trusted us when you had every reason to be terrified of the world." The club took a vote. Unanimous. Hammer held up the vest. On the back, stitched in flawless, miniature lettering, was the Hells Angels Cascade Charter logo, with a small patch on the front that read, "Honorary Member." Which means, Hammer smiled, "You're officially stuck with us." Sophie beamed, her missing front tooth making her smile all the brighter. She turned around, letting Hammer slip her arms into the heavy leather vest. It was a little big on her, but she looked like she was 10 feet tall. As she turned back around to face the crowd, 40 rough, road-hardened men erupted into deafening cheers, applause, and the stomping of heavy boots on the floorboards. Tank let out a piercing 2-finger whistle. Wrench threw his hands in the air. Grace walked up onto the stage, wiping a happy tear from her eye. She stopped beside Hammer, resting a gentle hand on the small of his back. A touch he leaned into with natural, undeniable familiarity. They had spent the last 6 months building a life together, moving past trauma and into something beautiful and permanent. Sophie grabbed both of their hands, pulling them tightly together as the club continued to cheer. They had lost everything on that highway, only to find exactly what they needed. Some families are born from blood. Others are forged in leather, forged on the asphalt, and bonded by the men who choose to stop when the rest of the world drives by.